What's up, everyone, and welcome to Making the Shift for Autistic Kids.
We're an SLP couple from California with 4 boys.
And we're here every week to bring you neuro-affirming tips, tricks, and tools.
Are you ready to make the shift?
Let's do this.
Hello. Welcome to Making the Shift. If you are just finding our little corner of the world, this is Making the Shift. It is a weekly live show where my partner and I give you neurodiversity affirming ways to support autistic kids. My partner, Chris, sometimes on the show, sometimes not. Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not, sometimes we're together. But fun fact, we are both speech pathologists and we are having our 5th boy. So I am very pregnant below what you can see here. So if I ever look or sound exhausted, you know why. If you don't know me, my name is Jessie Ginsburg. I own and run a top-rated speech therapy clinic here in Los Angeles where we see about 250 kids a week. I've also trained tens and thousands of parents and professionals around the world in how to support kids' communication using sensory strategies. And sensory is what we're talking about today. I also released a best-selling book earlier this year called Ready, Set, Connect, which has a bunch of different sensory strategies to support communication in autistic kids. What we want to talk about today is how everyone deserves a seat at the sensory table. Let me tell you, years ago when I started talking about sensory, my friends who were OTs would send me screenshots of people talking about me in their other Facebook groups saying, who is this and why is she? It was like some of the meanest things I've ever read about myself. It was like, who is this and why is she impinging on our scope, and SLPs don't do sensory. And, you know, it was just very hard at that time because I knew that SLPs needed sensory for reasons we will talk about today, but it just was not widely accepted. So what did I do? I started writing articles for our national magazine about the SLP's role in sensory, because if our national magazine was going to publish articles on how SLPs can use this, we can use this. And it starts to get everyone thinking about it. Started speaking for our national conferences. You know, there used to be no talks on sensory for SLPs. Now it's not very, but I guess there are a decent number of people talking about sensory when we're talking about supporting autistic kids as speech pathologists. But we're going to talk beyond just speech pathology today as well. And I also, at this time, was creating a course for SLPs because there were no options for SLPs to learn about sensory at the time. I took every course I could possibly get my hands on. I spent thousands and thousands of dollars learning from professionals who were not SLPs in how to use sensory strategies. And that included taking like a 1.5 year full coursework of sensory integration. I mean, I was doing as much as I possibly could, hiring OTs in my clinic. I just really wanted to learn as much as I could because I knew this information was so valuable. Okay. Over 90% of autistic kids have sensory differences. So that to me meant if you are a therapist of any kind, or you're a teacher, or you're a parent with an autistic child, you need to understand sensory, right? That made so much sense to me. So what I ended up doing while I was creating this course was I reached out to Dr. Winnie Dunn, who is a very famous occupational therapist, created the sensory profile, which is one of the most commonly used sensory assessments. And I chatted with her. I ended up bringing her in as a bonus lecture in my course as well, which was really incredible. But I got to talk to her about, what is your opinion on this, you know? And she was all on board with the idea that everyone should understand sensory. And in fact, she has a book where she explains sensory in a very easy to understand way, just for anyone on the street to pick up and learn more about, because she feels so strongly that people need to understand that. So I started saying, like, that kind of became one of my mottos, was everyone deserves a seat at the sensory table. You know, we all need sensory for different reasons. And when we try to gatekeep sensory and we try to say only one person or one type of professional can use sensory strategies, all that is doing is taking away from what we could be doing for our kids, right? Like the reason we use them is for them. It's not for us. It's so that we can have our kids to see more progress in whatever it is in the type of therapy that we're doing with them. So I will say though, I'm not a supporter of like every person under the sun should do every single sensory thing they can get their hands on. I still firmly believe that if you want to use sensory strategies, you need to learn about them. You need to do trainings, have a mentor, do what you need to do to feel confident. And it's the same thing I tell therapists that, like, for example, I would never have a parent come in with a kid who needed feeding therapy and then schedule them with one of my therapists who has never done feeding therapy. Even like maybe they took a 6-week course in grad school. Like, no, they need more training than that in order to do that effectively, right? And same thing with something like stuttering. We had a therapist in our clinic who was amazing at therapy for stutterers. And when she left, her kids went to another therapist who had great experience with stuttering. And when that therapist had babies and moved, guess what we did? We sent all of our families who had kids who stutter off to other clinics. We sent them to other specialists, right? So I think that this is one of those things where fortunately there are a lot more opportunities for learning now. And, to me, as long as you're putting in the work and you're attempting to learn, whether that's through a course or, free trainings or mentorship in your clinic with other professionals, I think that's a great place to start. But I do think that, we need to have training when we do these things. I think that's our ethical responsibility. So today we're talking about giving everyone a seat at the sensory table and what that means. And the thing is that when people say to me, SLPs, it's not in your scope to use sensory, then I automatically think, well, the reason we use sensory is different from the reason another person or professional would use sensory strategies, right? So today I want to talk about why these various professionals might use sensory strategies, right? So we're going to talk about OTs, PTs, teachers, parents, and SLPs. We're going to talk about why they need sensory training specifically and how they can help specifically for each child. But what I tell families all the time, and what I tell therapists when I'm training them, is that if a child is coming into the clinic and has such sensory differences that it's impacting their communication, that child very likely is going to benefit from other types of therapy as well, because sensory doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's not like a child with sensory differences would only have difficulties with communication. As you'll see after what we are going to talk about today, a child with sensory differences is likely going to have areas that are difficult for them across the board and therefore will benefit from many types of therapy. Okay, so let's talk first about OT, just because that's kind of the world I know we're all familiar with. When generally you think of a professional who is supporting sensory needs of kids, we think of OTs. They generally get the most training, or possibly even the only professional who gets formal training as part of grad school. But something that's important to say is that it depends on the school. It's just like when we went to grad school as SLPs, some grad schools had an autism course. My grad school had an autism course. A lot of other grad schools don't have an autism course. It's like 3 lectures within a language course or something like that. Or we had an AAC course that was an entire course for AAC. Some therapists or some grad schools will have like a guest lecture on AAC, right? So all training and all grad programs are not necessarily created equal. And for majority of OTs, sensory is something that they learn about in school, but then they go on to do additional trainings in, just like we as SLPs go on and do additional trainings and other things that we're interested in too, right? There's a very, very well-known school in our local area, OT school, And they probably get the most sensory training out of any of the grad programs. I think they get a full 2 semesters, which is a lot. Some grad programs don't have anything. So it is totally fine to ask therapists, if you're a parent here or another professional, like what their experience has been with it. It's just like parents coming to us and saying, hey, have you ever taken courses in Hannon's It Takes Two to Talk, right? It's another thing that we go on to learn about, and so that we can build our skills and grow in. Okay. But with OTs are generally the ones who are conducting sensory assessments. And if they are trained in sensory integration, like the program I went through, that might be something that they did. There is a bit of controversy surrounding that, because I'll tell you what the argument is, which is that the idea of sensory integration as an approach is to change the way that our brain processes sensory information. So there's a little bit of controversy there with some neurodivergent people who say, well, if we are neurodiversity affirming and we're embracing brain differences, why are we trying to change the way that the brain is processing? And, my opinion on that is that if the therapy is fun, if the therapy is child-led, if the therapist is allowing the child to feel trust, if the child's feeling supportive and enjoying the therapy, no issues, right? It's a lot different than when we're forcing kids to do something that they don't want to do. So OTs are very well known for working on activities of daily living, things like, getting dressed and brushing teeth and going to the bathroom and stuff like that. So when we think about how sensory impacts these things, it can impact them very much, right? And I'm just going to give you random examples as they come up. But if you're thinking about getting dressed, for example, as something that like OTs might help kids learn how to button buttons. Okay. If a child, in order to feel that button, has to have what's called tactile perception, right? So perception of touch. So they have to perceive that button and register it. And then they have to maneuver it into the hole, right? So if the child is having trouble perceiving or feeling that button between their fingers, that could be a very hard activity for them. When we think about things like interoception, which is our body's awareness of its internal sensations, we think about, we need interoception to know when our bladder is full, right? So if we're going to work on potty training with a child and a child doesn't feel when their bladder is full, that could be difficult. If we're working on things like eating and feeding with a child, and a child is having trouble understanding the sensation of their belly being empty, that could make it hard for a child. Going back to, touch perception and body awareness, lots of stuff with feeding, holding silverware, getting your food to your mouth, a lot of stuff there, right? So then, of course, OTs are also known for working on fine motor skills, things like perceiving that pencil between their fingers and then writing. And there's a lot of kids out there who are just breaking pencils all the time, and that's because they're having trouble knowing how much force to use. They might just be putting all of their force down on the pencil, which is part of the proprioceptive system, right? So a lot of these systems don't just like operate on their own. A lot of them are very much tied together in the things that we do. So we think about writing, grabbing puzzles, anything that's picking a bead out of a Play-Doh, right? That's all stuff that's happening with our fine motor, and that all very much depends on our ability to, perceive touch and know where our body is in space and all of that. So we get into gross motor skills, which, work a lot of OTs and PT have a lot of overlap in what they do with gross motor skills. But you think about teaching a child to kick a ball, for example. You're using your visual systems to see the ball moving toward you. You are using your vestibular system to move and proprioceptive system to move and walk toward that ball. You're using your proprioceptive system to decide how hard am I going to kick that ball. Okay, there's a difference between like, okay, the goal is 1 foot away, I just need to give the ball a tap, versus the goal is on the other side of the field, I need to hit it as hard as I can. And for kids with sensory differences, just that type of change or adjustment could be difficult for them. Like you might see the goal is only this far away, but they're still kicking that with as hard as they possibly can. Right? So we use our proprioception for that. I mean, we're constantly using our vestibular system, which is our sense of movement and balance. And that's just to be safely navigating the world around us. We think about climbing up on the play structure. We think about walking up the stairs or even just walking on the sidewalk. We're going to be using these sensory systems, right? So you could see how relevant sensory processing is to OTs because of how much what they do is impacted by our sensory systems and PTs as well. Okay, so let's talk about feeding therapists. And I know feeding generally is either an SLP or an OT, but you might have like dietitians, nutritionists, anyone like that. Huge impact. Sensory plays a huge impact on our feeding. I mean, it could be things like the child is really sensitive. They're sensitive to touch, sensitive to smell, sensitive to taste, and trying new foods might be difficult. It could be the opposite. The child could be less sensitive. So they could be the child who's constantly overstuffing their mouth. And then we have the entire equation of, but a child has to be, not has to be, I guess. I was going to say seated to eat, or maybe like in an ideal world where we are trying to teach a child to eat safely, you know, like babies, we don't necessarily want walking around eating big chunks of things that are going to be dangerous for them, right? But we might want a child to be like, we need a child to be well regulated enough to eat. If a child isn't regulated, they won't even feel hungry because their body's going to be in fight or flight. They're going to be in survival, and we don't feel hunger. And a lot of those basic needs don't feel like we need them when we are feeling like we're not in a place where we're safe. So then there's the idea of, well, how can we help to get our kids regulated in order to, you know, have them, whether it's seated at a table or just eating in general. Okay, so big, very relevant for feeding therapists as well, no matter what type of therapist it is. Okay, teachers. These are the professionals who need this knowledge the most and get it the least. I really feel like it's so unfair for so many of our teachers because they are put in a room with like 30 kids who all have different sensory needs, and then they're not given the appropriate support to be able to support those kids. And then all of a sudden we're like, why didn't my kid learn algebra? I thought your job was to teach them this. And it's like all the blame goes to the teacher, when in reality, it's just that the teacher doesn't have all of the ways to support the regulation in all of their kids, right? So we need to be regulated to learn. If we want kids sitting down at their desk or sitting down at circle time, or not even just sitting down, but just paying attention, which we need to learn, we need them regulated, right? So lots of sensory needed in the classroom for that reason, sensory education. And the other big thing I see affecting classrooms is that teachers need to be able to understand when a child's dysregulation is coming from an emotional place versus when it's coming from a physical place. And a lot of times emotional dysregulation manifests in a physical way. So we assume that it's coming from that place, that that's the root. So our solution becomes, let's give them the sensory they need because they're dysregulated. And then we don't see the problem getting any better. Okay, for example, child is trying to elope and move out of run out of the classroom. We think, oh, the classroom's loud. The child must be sensitive to noise. So I'm going to give the child noise canceling headphones more often. Okay. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, because of course that is can be very true for a lot of people. But we just make these assumptions a lot of times, like, oh, well, he doesn't like loud noises, so he must be running out of the classroom. It's like, well, maybe he's running out of the classroom because he's really emotionally dysregulated and he doesn't feel supported and validated and heard, and that's causing him to leave the classroom. But oftentimes we see like a child sensory seeking in some way. We assume it's just due to a sensory need, but it could very well be because of an emotional reason. So just something to think about, something that takes a lot of digging sometimes to figure out kind of what's under that iceberg of what we see, but very important for teachers because we want to help them. We want them to be successful with our kids in the classrooms. All right, let's talk about parents. Okay, parents need this information. Of course, parents are doing the things at home that all these professionals I've listed so far are doing at their place of work, right? Parents are helping their kids get dressed at home. They're feeding their kids at home. They're helping their kids use the bathroom and shower at home. They're helping their kids do their homework at home. They're talking and having conversations with their kids at home. There's no reason why parents should have the sensory education withheld from them. We really want to make sure that whatever it is that we're learning about a child's sensory system, we are then also taking to the parent and saying, now you can use it at home in this way. Do you see how he loves tight squeezes when we're reading books, and he's so engaged in this book when he's sitting on my lap and I'm giving him tight squeezes? I wonder if that's something that you could try to do before bed at home. You know, I know the nighttime routine can be difficult sometimes. I wonder if something like that could help, right? So we always want to take what we're learning. We want to translate it into how can this be beneficial to a parent in the home? Because otherwise we are just missing a huge, huge part of the impact that we can have on not only this child, but their entire family unit and therefore community, right? We always on our team talk about it almost like a ripple in the pond, where we're these people in here in our therapy bubble with a child, right? But the more professionals and parents that we can work with, the greater that ripple goes and the more positive effect it has on the child and their family. Okay, so last, let's talk about SLPs. My favorite, talking about why SLPs need sensory, right? We need to be regulated to communicate. This is not just kids. This is us too. It's us adults. When we are dysregulated, or as you may have heard them explain, like in the whole brain child, when we are in our downstairs brain and we are dysregulated, we can't even access the thinking parts of our brain. And when we're in speech therapy, what part of our brain do we need? The thinking part. We need the part that is generating language and telling stories and planning and problem solving and perspective taking. That is the part of the brain that we need to do our jobs. And if we have a child who's coming in, they're in survival mode, they're in fight or flight, right? They're going through this period where it's like they're in a stress state, a stress response. We will not have a productive session and we will not be able to make progress with that child over time. So our job is to help kids learn. We need our kids regulated to learn. We need our kids regulated to communicate. Okay, so you can see after talking about all these professionals why it's so important that every person has a seat at the sensory table, and that if a child has sensory differences that are impacting them in one area of life, it is very likely that it is impacting them in other areas of life as well. And we can do our best to be able to have more of a team and collaborative approach so that we can support this child just beyond the four walls of our therapy room. Okay, so if you are sitting here and you are in an SLP and you want to learn more about how SLPs specifically can use sensory strategies in your sessions, we are doing a big free training coming up. It's going to be right before Halloween. I will put a link below so that you can sign up for it. It's going to be a 3-hour free training. We're going to talk about why you need to understand sensory to be an ND affirming therapist, the relevance for SLPs. We're going to talk about sensory strategies that you can use in your speech sessions so that you can help your kids to make more progress, to be more engaged, to be communicating more. And we are going to have a special emphasis on AAC because happy AAC Awareness Month. That's what it is right now in October. So in this free event, we're also going to be talking specifically about AAC. So this is specifically for SLPs, but if you're a teacher or another professional sitting here, parent, whoever you are, you're welcome to sneak in if you want this info too. But if you ever want more of a training, like if you're sitting here as a parent and you really want this training specific to parents, go to sensoryslp.com, reach out. There are places for you to get trainings for parents as well. So really excited for this launch event. You don't want to miss it. This will be the last live event, live free event, I should say, before the baby comes, which means I will be even more pregnant and maybe I will paint my stomach like a pumpkin for the event. I don't know. We might get crazy. So make sure to join us. It's going to be a really good time. As always, thank you for being here, and we will see you on the flip side. Thank you so much for tuning in to Making the Shift. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to us if you could like, subscribe, share it with a friend. Our only goal is to spread neurodiversity affirming approaches all over the world, and we can only do that with your help. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.